The August sun bore down on the Dakota plains like a furnace door left wide open, and Victoria Zimmerman felt every scorching degree of it as she reached into the wicker basket for another damp sheet. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned the fabric to the clothesline stretching across the dusty yard behind the boarding house, where she had been working for the past 3 months. Fargo, North Dakota had seemed like a promising fresh start when she arrived in the spring of 1882, fleeing memories of her father's debts and her mother's early grave back in Pennsylvania. At 22 years old, she had imagined herself building something new in this frontier town where the railroad brought opportunity and the Red River promised prosperity. But today, with the temperature climbing past what anyone could remember for early August, prosperity felt like a cruel joke. The boarding house matron, Mrs. Hendricks, had assigned her the laundry duty at dawn, but Victoria had been delayed by a leak in the kitchen that needed tending first. Now it was nearly noon, and the sun showed no mercy. Sweat plastered her cotton dress to her back, and her bonnet felt like it was trapping all the heat of hell itself against her skull. She had already hung 2 full lines of sheets, pillowcases, and tablecloths, but the basket still held more than half its load. Victoria bent to retrieve another sheet, but when she straightened, the world tilted sideways. Black spots danced across her vision like a swarm of locusts, and her knees turned to water. She heard the wooden clothespins clatter to the hard, packed earth, heard her own gasping breath, and then nothing at all as the ground rushed up to meet her. She did not see the tall figure that had been leading his horse toward the stable behind the boarding house. She did not hear his boots hitting the ground at a run, or feel his calloused hands catching her before her head struck the ground. Killian Crawford had been riding since before sunrise, pushing hard to reach Fargo before nightfall, but when he saw the woman crumple like a rag doll beside the laundry line, every other concern vanished from his mind. He caught her awkwardly, one arm around her waist and the other beneath her shoulders, and lowered her gently to the narrow strip of shade cast by the building. Her face was flushed crimson with heat, her breathing shallow and rapid. Miss, can you hear me?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, raspy from trail dust and alarm. Victoria's eyelids fluttered but did not open. Killian glanced around the empty yard, then back at the woman. He had seen heat exhaustion before, had treated it in cattle drovers and ranch hands. Without hesitating, he scooped her up and carried her toward the back door of the boarding house, shouldering it open with more force than necessary. "Help! Someone help!" His shout echoed through the dim interior. Mrs. Hendricks appeared from the kitchen, flour dusting her apron, her eyes widening at the sight of her employee limp in the arms of a stranger. "Good Lord! What happened?" "Found her collapsed out by the laundry. Heat got her. She needs water and somewhere cool to lie down." Killian was already moving toward the parlor where he could see a settee. "Upstairs, second door on the right. That is her room." Mrs. Hendricks hurried ahead, leading the way up the narrow staircase. The room was small but neat, with a single window that Mrs. Hendricks threw open immediately, though the air that drifted in was barely cooler than what already filled the space. Killian laid Victoria on the narrow bed as gently as he could manage. Her bonnet had come loose during the collapse, and dark brown hair had escaped its pins, curling damply against her neck. "I will fetch water and cloths," Mrs. Hendricks said, already bustling toward the door. "Stay with her, young man. Make sure she does not try to rise too quickly." Killian nodded, pulling the room's single chair closer to the bedside. He removed his hat and ran a hand through hair that badly needed cutting, suddenly aware of how he must look after days on the trail. Dust coated his clothes, and he probably smelled like horse and sweat, but the woman on the bed was in no condition to notice. He studied her face, trying to determine if her color was improving. She was pretty, he realized, with high cheekbones and a determined set to her jaw even in unconsciousness. There was something familiar about her features, though he could not place why. Perhaps she just had one of those faces that reminded a person of someone else. Mrs. Hendricks returned with a basin of cool water and several clean rags. Poor girl has been working herself ragged since she arrived, too proud to admit when something is too much for her. She dipped a cloth in the water and pressed it to Victoria's forehead. "I am Constance Hendricks. This is my establishment, and you are Killian Crawford, madam. I was hoping to rent a room for a few nights." "Well, Mr. Crawford, you have certainly earned yourself favorable consideration." She handed him a dampened cloth. "Keep these cool on her wrists and forehead. I need to tend to the stove before my bread burns. Call out if she worsens." Left alone with the unconscious woman, Killian felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He dipped the cloth again, wrung it out, and carefully laid it across her forehead. Her eyelids fluttered at the touch, and a soft sound escaped her lips. "Take your time," he said quietly. "You are safe now." Several minutes passed in silence, broken only by the ticking of a clock somewhere downstairs and the distant sounds of Fargo's Main Street carrying through the window. Killian refreshed the cloths twice before Victoria's eyes finally opened, blinking against the light. Her gaze found his face and confusion flooded her features. "Who?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Name is Killian Crawford. Found you collapsed out by the laundry line. You have got heat exhaustion, but you are going to be fine." He reached for the cup of water Mrs. Hendricks had left. "Can you sit up enough to drink?" Victoria tried to push herself up on her elbows, but the effort made her head swim again. Killian slipped his arm behind her shoulders, supporting her weight as he brought the cup to her lips. She drank gratefully, the cool water soothing her parched throat. "The laundry," she said suddenly, trying to pull away. "I have to finish the laundry." "You have to rest," Killian corrected firmly, easing her back down to the pillow. "The laundry can wait. Mrs. Hendricks needs it done today. The rooms need fresh linens for the guests arriving on the evening train." Victoria's voice carried an edge of desperation. "I cannot afford to lose this position." Killian studied her flushed face and the determination in her eyes despite her obvious weakness. He understood pride and the fear of losing what little security one had managed to grasp. He had been in similar positions himself more times than he cared to count. "I will finish it," he heard himself say. Victoria blinked at him. "What? The laundry? I will hang it for you. You rest." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "You cannot. You do not even know me. Why would you?" Killian paused at the door, considering the question. Why indeed? He had his own business to attend to in Fargo, and it would not benefit him to get tangled up with a boarding house girl and her domestic troubles. But when he looked back at her, pale and worried on that narrow bed, the answer seemed simpler than any logic. "Because it is the right thing to do. Now rest, Miss Zimmerman. Doctor's orders. I am not a doctor. Close enough for today." He offered her a slight smile before heading downstairs. The heat struck him like a physical blow when he stepped back outside, but Killian had worked through worse. He found the laundry basket where Victoria had left it, the remaining wet linens heavy with water and starting to sour in the sun. The clothesline already held 2 full rows of sheets snapping in the hot wind, white against the impossibly blue sky. Killian had never claimed to be an expert at domestic work, but he had spent enough time on cattle drives where every man did his share of camp duties. He shook out a sheet, pinned one corner, stretched it across the line, and pinned the other side. The wet fabric soaked his shirt front, which actually felt refreshing in the oppressive heat. He fell into a rhythm, working steadily through the basket. Sheet after sheet, pillowcase after pillowcase, each one hung with careful precision. The work was mindless in a way that let his thoughts wander, which was dangerous territory. He had come to Fargo to meet with a banker about a loan. 6 years of working other people's ranches had finally given him enough saved to put a down payment on his own spread about 30 miles south of town. Good grassland with a creek running through it and enough timber for building. It was everything he had been working toward since he was 16 years old, and realized that ranch hand wages would never be enough to build the life he wanted. But the property would not stay on the market forever, and the banker he was supposed to meet tomorrow held the key to his entire future. He should be thinking about that, preparing his case for why he was a good investment. Instead, he found himself thinking about a woman with dark hair and determined eyes who pushed herself too hard because she understood what it meant to fight for something better. "Well, I will be, Mrs." Hendrix's voice came from behind him. "When you said you would finish it, I thought you were just trying to ease her mind." Killian turned, a wet tablecloth in his hands. "I do not make promises I cannot keep, madam. A rare quality in a man." She studied him with the assessing gaze of someone who had seen too many drifters and chancers pass through her doors. "The girl will be grateful when she wakes properly. She worries too much about losing her place here. How long has she been with you?" 3 months, give or take." Came off the train with one small trunk and desperation in her eyes. "I have seen that look before, running from something or towards something, hard to say which." Mrs. Hendrix shaded her eyes against the sun. "She is a good worker, though, honest and reliable. Just needs to learn that killing herself with labor helps nobody." Killian hung the last pillowcase and lifted the empty basket. "Where does this go?" "Kitchen porch. And then you come inside and have something cold to drink before you collapse yourself." "Cannot have 2 patients on my hands in one day." The cool dimness of the kitchen was a blessing after the brutal sun. Mrs. Hendrix poured him a glass of buttermilk from the icebox and gestured toward a chair at the scarred wooden table. Killian drank deeply, feeling the cold liquid settle in his stomach. "About that room," Mrs. Hendrix said, settling into a chair across from him. "You can have number 5 for $2 a night, meals included. Or if you are planning a longer stay, I can offer you a weekly rate. 3 nights should be sufficient. I have business with First Bank of Dakota tomorrow." "Ah, you will be meeting with Douglas Pemberton then. Careful with that one. He drives a hard bargain and has foreclosed on more than one hopeful rancher." There was no judgment in her tone, just the practical warning of someone who had seen the pattern repeat itself. "I have done my homework. My finances are solid." Killian hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. The truth was, he was stretching himself thin with this land purchase, gambling everything on his ability to make the ranch profitable within 2 years. Mrs. Hendrix nodded slowly. "I believe you." A man who stops to help a stranger and finishes her laundry in the August heat is not the type to go into a business deal unprepared. She stood and pulled a key from the ring at her waist. "Room 5 is at the end of the hall upstairs. I will have Victoria bring up fresh water for washing once she is recovered. No need to trouble her, I can fetch my own water." Stubborn pride must be catching. But Mrs. Hendrix smiled as she said it. "Very well. Supper is at 6. Do not be late." Killian took his saddlebags up to room 5, which proved to be small but clean with a decent bed and a window overlooking the street. He could hear the sounds of Fargo going about its business below, the creak of wagon wheels, the calls of merchants, the occasional burst of laughter from one of the saloons. It was a good town, prosperous enough to support his future business dealings, but not so large as to lose its frontier character. He stripped off his dust-caked shirt and poured water from the pitcher into the wash basin, scrubbing away the grime of travel. His reflection in the small mirror showed a man weathered by sun and hard work, with lines around his eyes from squinting across long distances, and a jaw that needed shaving. At 28, he was old enough to know what he wanted and young enough to still believe he could achieve it. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, Victoria stood in the hallway, still pale but upright and composed. She had changed into a fresh dress and pinned her hair back properly, though a few rebellious curls still escaped at her temples. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice stronger than it had been earlier. "What you did today, finishing the laundry when you did not have to, I am grateful." "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Victoria said firmly. "They really would not have. I have lived here long enough to know that most men would have fetched help and considered their duty done. You went beyond that." Killian leaned against the doorframe, studying her. Up close and conscious, she was more than pretty. There was an intelligence in her eyes and a strength in the set of her shoulders that spoke of someone who had faced hardship and refused to break beneath it. "You are feeling better then?" "Much. Mrs. Hendricks made me drink enough water to float a steamboat and lie down for 3 hours. I am told I missed the afternoon entirely." A hint of frustration colored her words. "I still have evening duties to attend to, but I wanted to find you first." "I am glad you are recovered. That was quite a scare." Victoria's cheeks colored slightly. "I am not usually so foolish. I know better than to work through the hottest part of the day like that, but I was running behind this morning and I just thought I could push through. Clearly, I thought wrong. We all make mistakes when we are trying too hard." Killian surprised himself with the gentleness in his own voice. "The important thing is you are all right now. Thanks to you." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of two people who understood what it meant to fight for a foothold in an uncertain world. The moment broke when Mrs. Hendricks called up the stairs. "Victoria, the vegetables for supper will not chop themselves. I should go." Victoria stepped back, smoothing her skirts. "I will see you at supper, Mr. Crawford. Killian, please." A small smile touched her lips. "Victoria. Since we have already passed beyond formal acquaintance anyway." He watched her descend the stairs, her hand light on the railing, before retreating back into his room. The afternoon stretched ahead with little to do except prepare for tomorrow's meeting, but Killian found his concentration scattered. He kept seeing Victoria's face as she collapsed, kept feeling the weight of her in his arms, kept hearing the determination in her voice when she insisted she had to finish the laundry. Supper at Mrs. Hendricks's boarding house proved to be a communal affair, with all guests gathered around a long table in the dining room. Besides Killian, there were 2 traveling salesmen, a middle-aged widow waiting for her son to arrive from Chicago, and an elderly gentleman who seemed to be a permanent resident. Victoria served the meal with quiet efficiency, her movements graceful despite the afternoon's ordeal. The food was simple but well prepared: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread. Killian ate with the appetite of someone who had been living on trail rations for the past week. Conversation flowed around the table, the salesmen trading stories of their routes, the widow fretting about her son's delay, the elderly gentleman offering commentary on Fargo's growth since he had arrived 5 years prior. "The railroad changed everything," he declared, waving his fork for emphasis. "Before the Northern Pacific came through, this was nothing but a trading post and a handful of rough buildings. Now look at us. 2 banks, 3 hotels, a proper school. Why, we will be applying for proper city status any year now. Progress always comes with a price," one of the salesmen said. "I remember when you could drink the river water without worry. Now, with all the traffic and development, a man takes his chances." Victoria moved around the table refilling water glasses, and when she reached Killian, their eyes met briefly. He saw fatigue in her face despite her obvious efforts to hide it, and concern tightened his chest. After supper, the guests dispersed to their various entertainments. The salesman headed for the nearest saloon, the widow retired to her room with a book, and the elderly gentleman settled into the parlor with a newspaper. Killian considered joining the salesman, but the thought of a smoky saloon held little appeal. Instead, he found himself drawn to the back porch where evening shadows were finally bringing relief from the day's heat. Victoria was there, sitting on the steps and staring out at the darkening prairie. She startled when his boots sounded on the boards, half rising before she recognized him. "I am sorry, I did not mean to intrude," Killian said. "I can go if you prefer solitude." "No, it is fine. Please sit if you like." She gestured to the space beside her on the steps. He settled down carefully, leaving a respectable distance between them. For several minutes, neither spoke. The evening air carried the scent of grass and dust, and something cooking from one of the nearby houses. A meadowlark sang its final song of the day from somewhere in the gathering dusk. "I grew up in Pennsylvania," Victoria said suddenly. "Near Pittsburgh. Everything there was smoke and noise and coal dust. When I first arrived here and saw all this open space, I could not quite believe it was real." She gestured toward the prairie stretching endlessly beyond the town's edge. "So much room, so much sky. What brought you all the way out here?" Killian asked, though he suspected the answer would be some variation of the same story that brought most people west. "Desperation, if I am being honest. My father died owing money he did not have, and the creditors were circling. My mother passed 2 years before him, so there was no one left but me. I could either stay and spend my life working to pay off debts that were not mine, or I could leave and try to build something of my own." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "So I took what little I had and bought a train ticket as far as my money would carry me. That turned out to be Fargo." "Do you regret it?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "Some days, yes. When the work is hard and the loneliness creeps in, I wonder if I made a terrible mistake. But then I remember what I left behind, and I know that at least here I have a chance. Back there, I had nothing but other people's expectations and debts. I understand that more than you might think." Killian found himself speaking before he had decided whether to share his own story. "My parents died when I was 15. Influenza took them both within a week of each other. The bank claimed the family farm for outstanding loans, and just like that, I was alone with nothing but the clothes on my back and a decent horse. I have been working toward getting my own land ever since. 13 years is a long time to wait for something. It is. But tomorrow, if everything goes according to plan, that wait finally ends. I am meeting with a banker about a loan for a property south of here. 320 acres with good water and grazing. It is not a huge spread, but it is mine. Will be mine," he corrected. Victoria turned to look at him fully, and even in the fading light, he could see the understanding in her eyes. "Then I hope it goes well for you. I truly do. Heaven knows we all deserve to see our struggles rewarded eventually." "What about you? What are your plans beyond working at this boarding house?" She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Plans feel like a luxury I cannot quite afford yet. For now, I am focused on keeping my position here and saving every penny I can. Beyond that," she shrugged, "I suppose I will figure it out as I go. Maybe eventually I will have saved enough to open my own establishment, though that dream feels very far away. Dreams have a way of taking longer than we expect, but arriving when we need them most," Killian said. At least, that is what I tell myself during the hard years. They sat in companionable silence as full darkness settled over Fargo. Stars began to prick through the deepening blue overhead, more stars than Victoria had ever seen in Pittsburgh's smoke-hazed skies. The heat of the day finally broke, replaced by a pleasant coolness that made the porch feel like a sanctuary. "I should go in," Victoria said eventually, though she made no move to rise. "Mrs. Hendricks will need help with the breakfast preparations at dawn, and after today's incident, I cannot afford to be late." "Take care of yourself," Killian said. "No job is worth destroying your health over," says the man who spent the afternoon hanging laundry in brutal heat. But she smiled as she said it. "Thank you again for that. You may have saved more than my health today. You may have saved my livelihood." She stood, brushing dust from her skirts, and Killian rose as well. For a moment, they stood facing each other on the darkened porch, and he felt the pull of something he could not quite name. Attraction, certainly, but also recognition. They were two people who had been knocked down by life and were fighting their way back up through sheer determination. "Good night, Victoria." "Good night, Killian, and good luck tomorrow." He watched her slip back into the boarding house before returning his gaze to the prairie. The meeting tomorrow would determine everything he had been working toward for 13 years. He should be thinking about that, planning his words, preparing his arguments for why Douglas Pemberton should take a chance on him. But instead, his thoughts kept returning to a woman with dark hair and determined eyes who had collapsed in the heat rather than admit defeat. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising another scorcher. Killian dressed carefully in his best shirt and pants, which were still trail-worn but clean. He shaved with particular attention, wanting to make the best possible impression on the banker who held his future in his hands. Breakfast at the boarding house was a hearty affair of eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and strong coffee. Victoria served the meal with her usual quiet efficiency, but when she refilled Killian's coffee cup, she leaned close enough to whisper, "You look very presentable." "The banker would be a fool not to see you are a good risk." The words warmed him more than the coffee. "Thank you. I hope you are right. I have a sense about these things." She moved on to the next guest before he could respond. The First Bank of Dakota occupied a substantial brick building on Fargo's Main Street. Its solid construction meant to inspire confidence in depositors. Killian entered precisely on time for his 10 o'clock appointment and was shown into Douglas Pemberton's office by a young clerk. Pemberton proved to be a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the calculating gaze of someone who had seen every scheme and scam the frontier had to offer. He gestured for Killian to sit and opened the folder on his desk. "Mr. Crawford, I have reviewed your application for a loan of $800 to purchase the Morton property south of town. You have been working as a ranch hand for various outfits over the past 13 years, most recently for the Double Bar Ranch. Your references speak well of your work ethic and character." He paused, studying Killian over his spectacles. "However, $800 is a substantial sum, and ranching is a notoriously uncertain business. What makes you confident you can make this venture profitable enough to repay the loan with interest?" Killian had prepared for this question. "I have spent 13 years learning every aspect of ranch operation, from cattle management to land stewardship to business planning. The Morton property has excellent water access and enough grazing for a starter herd of about 50 head, which I can purchase with my savings after the down payment. The market for beef is strong, with the railroad providing reliable transport to eastern markets. I have calculated that even with conservative estimates, I can turn a profit within the first year and have the loan fully repaid within 4 years. Conservative estimates are one thing. Reality is often quite different. Pemberton leaned back in his chair. What happens if there is a drought? Or a harsh winter that decimates your herd? Or prices drop due to market forces beyond your control? I have accounted for those possibilities in my planning. I am not going into this blind or naive, Mr. Pemberton. I have seen ranches fail and I have seen them succeed. The difference usually comes down to preparation and willingness to adapt. I have both. For the next hour, Pemberton grilled him on every aspect of his business plan, probing for weaknesses and testing his knowledge. Killian answered each question as thoroughly as he could, drawing on 13 years of accumulated experience and observation. He could feel sweat dampening his shirt despite the relatively cool interior of the bank, but he kept his voice steady and his answers confident. Finally, Pemberton closed the folder and removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief. "You have clearly done your homework, Mr. Crawford. I will be honest with you. I have had this conversation with dozens of hopeful ranchers over the years. Most of them were woefully unprepared for the realities of running their own operation. They saw the romance of owning land without understanding the brutal work it requires." Killian's heart sank. This was the prelude to rejection. He could hear it in Pemberton's tone. "However," the banker continued, "you strike me as different from that usual lot. Your references are impeccable, your planning is sound, and you have clearly learned from observing both successes and failures. I am prepared to approve your loan with the following terms." Relief flooded through Killian so powerfully he almost missed the next words. The terms were strict but fair. $800 at 6% interest, to be repaid over 4 years with quarterly payments. The property itself would serve as collateral, along with any livestock and equipment purchased with the loan. Miss a payment and the bank could foreclose immediately. "I understand and accept your terms," Killian said, extending his hand. Pemberton shook it firmly. "Then congratulations, Mr. Crawford. You are now a landowner. My clerk will draw up the papers for your signature. You can take possession of the property immediately." Walking out of the bank an hour later with the deed in his pocket, Killian felt like his feet were not quite touching the ground. 13 years of working for other people, sleeping in bunkhouses, taking orders, watching other men build what he dreamed of building. All of it had led to this moment. He needed to celebrate, to share this victory with someone who would understand what it meant. And before he consciously decided where his feet were taking him, he found himself heading back toward the boarding house. Victoria was beating rugs in the side yard when he arrived, her sleeves rolled up and hair escaping from its pins again. She looked up at his approach and must have seen something in his face because she dropped the carpet beater and hurried over. "Well, how did it go?" "I got it." The words came out breathless with joy. "The loan, the property, all of it. I am a landowner, Victoria." Her face lit up with genuine delight. "Oh, Killian, that is wonderful. I am so happy for you." She seemed to forget propriety entirely and threw her arms around him in a quick, impulsive hug. He caught her without thinking, his arms going around her waist, and for a moment they stood like that in the side yard of the boarding house. She smelled like soap and sunshine and something floral he could not name. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed pink. "I am sorry, that was too forward of me," she said quickly. "Do not apologize. It was perfect." He realized he was still holding her hands and reluctantly released them. "I wanted to tell you first. I know that probably sounds strange since we only just met, but I felt like you would understand what this means." "I do understand. Completely." Her eyes shone with an emotion he could not quite read. "So what happens now? Now I take possession of the property and start building. There is a small cabin already there, nothing fancy but habitable. I need to ride out today to assess exactly what needs doing first." He hesitated, an idea forming. "Would you like to see it? The property, I mean. I realize you have duties here, but Mrs. Hendricks might give you an afternoon off if you explained." Victoria bit her lip, clearly torn between wanting to go and the practical concerns of her position. "I should not. There is so much work to do here, and after yesterday's collapse I cannot ask for favors. Let me talk to Mrs. Hendricks. Maybe I can persuade her." He found the boarding house proprietress in the kitchen, up to her elbows in bread dough. She listened to his request with an expression that suggested she saw right through his intentions but was not entirely opposed to them. "That girl works harder than anyone I have ever employed," Mrs. Hendricks said, punching down the dough with practiced efficiency. "She could use an afternoon away from scrubbing floors and washing dishes. But I expect her back before supper service, and you will behave as a gentleman, Mr. Crawford." "You have my word, madam." "Then go ahead and steal away my best worker for the afternoon. Heaven knows she has earned a bit of joy after all she has been through." Victoria looked stunned when he returned with permission granted. She really said yes. She really did. "So if you would like to accompany me to see the property, we should leave soon to make the most of the daylight. Give me 10 minutes to change into my riding skirt and fetch my bonnet." She was back in 8 minutes, wearing a practical split skirt and looking younger than her 22 years with excitement dancing in her eyes. Killian had rented a buggy from the livery, thinking it would be more comfortable than asking Victoria to ride his saddle horse. The journey south from Fargo took them through rolling prairie land, dotted with wildflowers and interrupted by occasional stands of cottonwood trees. The heat built as midday approached, but a steady breeze kept it bearable. Victoria sat beside him on the buggy seat, drinking in the landscape with obvious appreciation. "How far is the property?" she asked. "About 10 miles from town. Close enough to reach the railroad for shipping cattle, far enough out to have room to expand if things go well." He pointed ahead to where the land began to rise slightly. Just beyond that ridge, when they crested the rise, the property spread out before them. A creek wound through the center, lined with trees that would provide shade for livestock. The grass grew thick and green near the water, fading to gold on the higher ground, and there, tucked into a grove of cottonwoods, stood a small log cabin with a stone chimney. "Oh, Killian," Victoria breathed. "It is beautiful." He saw it through her eyes and had to agree. After years of imagining this moment, the reality of finally seeing his own land hit him with overwhelming force. This was his. Every acre, every blade of grass, every possibility for the future. He drove the buggy down to the cabin and helped Victoria step down. She walked slowly around the property, trailing her fingers through the tall grass, stopping to watch the creek burble over smooth stones. He followed at a distance, giving her space to explore while he tried to catalog everything that would need his immediate attention. The cabin was in better shape than he had expected. One room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, and windows that still held most of their glass. The previous owner had left a rough table and 2 chairs, a bed frame, and not much else. But the roof looked sound and the floor only needed minor repairs. "It has good bones," Victoria said from the doorway. "With some work it could be quite comfortable." "That is what I am hoping. I will need to add a barn and some fencing for the cattle, but those can wait until after I get settled in and purchase my starter herd." He ran his hand along the fireplace mantel. "I am thinking I will move in within the week. No sense paying for the boarding house when I have my own place now." Something flickered across Victoria's face, an expression he might have called disappointment if he had been more presumptuous. "That makes sense. You will have plenty to occupy you here." They walked down to the creek, and Victoria sat on a flat rock at the water's edge, removing her bonnet to let the breeze cool her face. Killian settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "When I was hanging that laundry yesterday," he said, surprising himself by speaking the thought aloud, "I was thinking about how strange life is. 2 days ago we did not know each other existed. Now I cannot quite imagine not having met you." Victoria turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "I know what you mean. It feels like something shifted when you caught me before I hit the ground, like the trajectory of my life changed in that moment. Maybe it did. Maybe both our trajectories changed." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. "I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other a day, but I feel something with you that I have never felt before." "So do I," she admitted softly. "It terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I came here to build something stable for myself, to not depend on anyone else. And now here you are, and all I can think about is how much I want to see you again after today." Her voice wavered slightly. "What if I am making the same mistake my mother made? She fell hard for my father, married him within 3 months of meeting, and spent the rest of her life dealing with the consequences of his poor choices." Killian took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I cannot promise I will never make mistakes or that life will always be easy. But I can promise that I will never be careless with your trust. I have worked too hard for what I have to throw it away on foolishness. And if you give me a chance, I will work just as hard to build something good with you." That is a very serious statement for a man who met me yesterday. "I have always believed in recognizing important things when they appear in your life. You are an important thing, Victoria Zimmerman. I knew it the moment I caught you falling." She squeezed his hand, and they sat in silence for a long moment, the creek singing over stones and the wind whispering through the grass. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "I would like to see you again. After today, I mean, if you want that too. I want that more than I can properly express. Would you allow me to court you, properly, with all the respect and patience you deserve?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I would like that very much." He wanted to kiss her. The urge was powerful enough that he had to consciously resist leaning in, but he had promised Mrs. Hendricks to behave as a gentleman, and he had just promised Victoria patience. So instead, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we should probably head back before Mrs. Hendricks sends a search party." The ride back to Fargo passed in comfortable conversation. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their futures. Victoria spoke of her desire to someday have a real home, not just a rented room. Killian described his plans for building up his herd and eventually expanding the cabin into a proper house. When they arrived back at the boarding house with an hour to spare before supper service, Mrs. Hendricks took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "I take it the property met expectations?" she asked. "Beyond expectations," Killian confirmed. "Thank you for allowing Victoria the afternoon away. Do not thank me yet. She will be working double time tomorrow to make up for it." But her tone was gentle, and she shooed Victoria inside with instructions to change and help with supper preparations. Over the next week, Killian moved his few belongings out to the property and began the work of making it truly his. He rose before dawn to tend to immediate repairs and improvements, then spent his afternoons riding back to Fargo to see Victoria. They fell into a pattern of evening walks after she finished her duties, strolling through town or sitting on the boarding house porch while dusk settled over the prairie. They talked about their childhoods, their fears, their hopes. Victoria admitted she sometimes woke from nightmares about being dragged back to Pennsylvania to face her father's creditors. Killian confessed that he still dreamed of the day the bank took his family's farm, the helplessness of watching everything his parents built get claimed by strangers. "We both know what it is to lose everything," Victoria said one evening as they sat on the porch steps. "Maybe that is why this feels right. We understand what the other has survived." "Maybe," Killian agreed. "Or maybe it would have felt right regardless. Maybe we were just lucky enough to find each other at the right time." By the end of August, Killian had completed the most urgent repairs to the cabin and was ready to purchase his starter herd. He asked Victoria if she would like to accompany him to the livestock auction in Moorhead, just across the Red River. She arranged a rare full day off, and they set out early on a Saturday morning. The auction was a chaotic affair with buyers and sellers shouting, cattle bawling, and dust rising in clouds from hundreds of hooves. But Killian navigated it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. He purchased 50 head of young cows, a bull, and 2 horses to help with herding. The price was fair, and he arranged for delivery to his property the following week. "You are really doing this," Victoria said as they watched the cattle mill in their pens, "building a ranch from nothing." "We are really doing it," he corrected. "If you want to be part of it, that is." She looked up at him, surprise and something deeper in her eyes. "Are you asking what I think you are asking?" "Not yet. Not officially. We have only known each other a month, and I promised you patience. But I am telling you that when I imagine my future, you are in it. Always." He took her hand. "So yes, I suppose I am asking you to start thinking about whether you could see yourself building a life here with me." Victoria's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I have been thinking about little else for weeks, and the answer is yes. When you are ready to ask properly, the answer will be yes." September arrived with slightly cooler temperatures and the beginning of autumn color in the cottonwood leaves. Killian's cattle were delivered and settled onto the property, and he spent long days building fence and preparing for winter. But no matter how tired he was, he always found time to ride into Fargo at least every other day to see Victoria. Mrs. Hendricks watched their courtship unfold with obvious approval. "That man is smitten with you," she told Victoria one afternoon, "and unless I miss my guess, he will be asking you to marry him before the snow flies. Do you think I am foolish?" Victoria asked, pausing in her work scrubbing the kitchen floor. "We have only known each other 2 months. I think when you know, you know. I knew I would marry Mr. Hendricks 3 weeks after we met. We had 42 good years before the Lord took him home." Mrs. Hendricks's expression softened with memory. "Do not let fear of moving too fast rob you of happiness, child. Life is uncertain enough without adding unnecessary hesitation to the mix." The proposal came on a golden October afternoon, when the prairie grass had turned to burnished bronze, and the sky stretched impossibly blue overhead. Killian had invited Victoria out to the property to see the improvements he had made, and she arrived to find he had cleaned the cabin until it shone and picked wildflowers that now sat in a jar on the rough table. "This is lovely," she said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. He had built proper shelves, hung curtains at the windows, and added a rocking chair near the fireplace. "It is not much yet," Killian said, suddenly nervous in a way he had not felt even when meeting with the banker. "But it could be more. It could be a real home if you were willing to share it with me." He dropped to one knee on the cabin floor, and Victoria's hands flew to her mouth. "Victoria Zimmerman, I know we have not known each other long by most people's standards. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about this. You are brave and strong and kind, and every day I spend with you makes me want to build a life worthy of keeping you by my side. Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a struggling rancher who has nothing to offer but hard work and a heart that is completely yours? Yes, Victoria said through tears that were now falling freely. Yes, Killian, I will marry you. He rose and swept her into his arms, kissing her properly for the first time. She melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and the kiss deepened with all the pent-up longing of their careful courtship. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. I do not have a ring yet, Killian admitted, but I will get you one as soon as I can. I do not need a ring, I just need you. Victoria touched his face gently. When should we marry? As soon as possible if you are willing. I know you will want time to prepare, but I have to confess I am not interested in a long engagement. Neither am I. What about 3 weeks? That should give me time to finish my obligations to Mrs. Hendricks and make proper arrangements. They married on the last Saturday in October in Fargo's small Methodist church. Mrs. Hendricks stood up as Victoria's witness, and Killian's former boss from the Double Bar Ranch served as his. Victoria wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Hendricks had helped her sew, and Killian wore his best suit that he had purchased specially for the occasion. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Killian kissed his bride with such tender joy that several of the assembled guests wiped away tears. The reception at the boarding house was a modest affair with cake and punch, but Victoria had never felt richer than she did standing beside her new husband, accepting congratulations from the small community that had become her home. That night, Killian drove them out to the ranch under a canopy of stars. He carried Victoria over the threshold of the cabin that was now their home, setting her down gently in the firelight he had prepared earlier. "Welcome home, Mrs. Crawford," he said softly. "I like the sound of that." She took his hand and led him toward the bed he had made up with fresh linens. "I like it very much." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a physical expression of everything they had been building toward for 3 months. Afterward, lying wrapped in each other's arms with the fire burning low, Victoria felt a contentment she had never known existed. "Are you happy?" Killian asked, his voice drowsy. "More than I ever imagined possible. Are you, beyond measure?" He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for taking a chance on me." "Thank you for catching me when I fell," she whispered back. The first year of their marriage was harder than either had anticipated but also more rewarding. Winter proved brutal with temperatures plunging well below zero and snow drifting higher than the cabin windows. But they weathered it together, keeping the fire burning and the livestock fed, growing closer with each challenge they overcame. Victoria proved to have a natural aptitude for ranch work. She learned to ride better, to help with calving, to keep the account books that tracked every penny they earned and spent. Killian had never been more grateful for a partner, and he told her so regularly. Spring brought relief and new life. Their first calf crop was healthy, and they sold the steers for good profit. By summer, they had made their first loan payment with money left over to begin building additions to the cabin. Killian added a proper kitchen and a second bedroom, planning ahead for the family he hoped they would have. Victoria discovered she was pregnant in late summer of 1883, a year after they had met. The news filled Killian with such joy he lifted her off her feet and spun her in circles despite her laughing protests. "Careful, you will make me dizzy." "I cannot help it. We are going to have a baby, a real family." He set her down gently, his hands going protectively to her still flat stomach. "How are you feeling? Should you rest? What do you need?" "I need you to stop fussing. I am pregnant, not made of glass." But she smiled as she said it, touched by his concern. Their son was born in March of 1884, arriving during a late-season snowstorm that kept the doctor from reaching the ranch in time. Mrs. Hendricks, who had become like a mother to Victoria, arrived just in time to help deliver the baby with Killian's assistance. They named him James Henry Crawford, and Killian held his son with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you for all of this." The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were difficult winters and dry summers, years when cattle prices dropped and they had to tighten their belts. But there were also triumphs. The herd grew steadily, and by 1886 they had expanded to 200 head. Killian built Victoria the proper house he had promised, with real wood floors and glass windows and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Their daughter Rose was born in 1887, followed by another son, Thomas, in 1889. The house that had seemed so spacious when they built it filled with the noise and chaos of family life, and Killian could not have been happier. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they stood on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Their children played in the yard under the supervision of their eldest, James, who at 10 was already showing signs of becoming a fine rancher himself. "You remember the day we met?" Victoria asked, leaning into Killian's embrace. "Every detail." "You collapsed in the heat halfway through hanging the laundry. I thought my heart would stop when I saw you fall. And you finished hanging it while I rested. I knew right then that you were different from other men." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not been there that day? If you had arrived an hour earlier or later? I try not to think about it. The thought of missing you, of never having all this, is too terrible to contemplate." He kissed her softly. "I prefer to believe that fate or providence or whatever you want to call it brought us together exactly when we needed each other most. I believe that too. I was so lost when I came to Fargo, so afraid of what my future held. And then you appeared and changed everything." Victoria rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you, Killian Crawford, more with every passing year. And I love you, Victoria Crawford. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, you and our children and this life we have built together." The children's laughter rang out across the prairie, carried on the evening breeze. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed as they settled for the night. The windmill Killian had installed last year creaked rhythmically, pumping water from the deep well that ensured they would never go thirsty. This was everything he had dreamed of during those long years working other people's ranches. But it was more than that, because he had never imagined finding someone like Victoria. Someone who matched his determination with her own, who faced hardship with courage, who made every victory sweeter by sharing it. As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge, they called the children inside for supper. The family gathered around the large table Killian had built, saying grace before diving into the meal Victoria had prepared. There was laughter and chatter, the occasional squabble between siblings, and the deep contentment of people who knew they were exactly where they belonged. Later, after the children were tucked into bed and the house had grown quiet, Killian and Victoria returned to the porch. It had become their habit over the years, these quiet moments at day's end when they could simply be together. "I was thinking," Victoria said, "that we should invite Mrs. Hendricks out for Thanksgiving this year. She has been like family to us, and she should not spend the holiday alone in that boarding house." "That is a fine idea. We could invite some of our other friends as well. The house is certainly big enough now to host a proper gathering. Look at us, planning Thanksgiving dinners and worrying about hosting guests. Do you remember when we thought owning a few cattle and having a roof that did not leak would be the height of success? Killian laughed. We have come a long way from that cabin with one room and more hope than sense. But I would do it all again exactly the same way if it meant ending up here with you. Even the part where I collapsed from heat exhaustion, especially that part. That is where our story really began. Victoria smiled and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the night sounds of the prairie they had made their home. The ranch continued to prosper over the following years. By the time their youngest son Thomas started school, the Crawford Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the region. But Killian and Victoria never forgot where they had started, or how close they had both come to very different futures. They remained active in the Fargo community, supporting the church and the school, helping newer settlers get established just as others had helped them. Victoria became known for her generosity to women arriving alone in Dakota territory, offering advice and sometimes employment to those who reminded her of her younger self. As their children grew, each found their own path. James stayed on the ranch, learning the business and eventually taking over much of the daily operation. Rose married a schoolteacher and moved to town, though she visited the ranch frequently with her own growing family. Thomas showed an aptitude for numbers, and eventually became a partner in the very bank that had once held Killian's future in its hands. On a warm summer evening in 1904, 22 years after their first meeting, Killian and Victoria sat on their porch surrounded by their children and grandchildren. It was James's birthday, and the whole family had gathered for a celebration. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, their oldest grandchild asked how Grandma and Grandpa had met. Victoria looked at Killian, and they shared a smile full of private memories and shared history. "Well," Killian began, "it was the hottest day of August in 1882, and your grandmother collapsed halfway through hanging the laundry in the heat. And your grandfather finished it while I rested," Victoria continued, reaching for Killian's hand. "That was the day everything changed." "Was it love at first sight?" the child asked with the romantic notion of youth. "It was something even better," Killian said, pulling Victoria closer. "It was recognition at first sight. I looked at your grandmother and saw someone who understood what it meant to fight for a better future. Someone brave enough to build something from nothing. Someone I wanted beside me for every day of my life. And I looked at your grandfather," Victoria added, "and saw someone who would catch me when I fell, who would finish tasks I could not complete, who would stand beside me through every storm. Someone worth taking a chance on." As the family gathered around them, full of warmth and laughter and love, Killian reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought him to that boarding house yard on that sweltering August day. He had been looking for a room to rent. Instead, he had found his entire future. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things and home. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. Inside the house, someone started playing the piano Victoria had insisted they buy 5 years ago, and soon voices joined in song. This was the life they had built together from two lonely people with nothing but determination and hope. This was the family that had grown from a chance meeting, and a willingness to take a risk on something neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Killian leaned close to Victoria and whispered, "Thank you for collapsing that day." She laughed, the sound still as bright and joyful as it had been 22 years ago. "Thank you for being there to catch me. And for hanging all that laundry in the brutal heat." Best decision I ever made, he said, kissing her temple. Well, second best. The best was asking you to marry me, and my best decision was saying yes. Victoria rested her head on his shoulder, watching their family gathered in the golden lamplight. Though I think we can both agree that fate or providence or whatever you want to call it made the real decision for us that day. Maybe so. But I like to think we had something to do with it too. We chose to see the possibility in each other. We chose to build something together instead of facing the world alone. Those were our choices, and I would make them again every single day. The stars emerged one by one as darkness claimed the prairie, the same stars that had witnessed their wedding vows, that had shone down on countless nights of struggle and triumph, that would continue to wheel overhead long after they were gone. But for now they were here, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a love well earned. The laundry that had brought them together had long since worn out and been replaced. The boarding house where Victoria had once worked had been sold and converted to other use. Even the small cabin where they had started their married life was now used as storage, replaced by the substantial house that represented their success. But the core of what they had built remained unchanged. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had chosen to face an uncertain future together, who had worked and loved and struggled and triumphed side by side for more than 2 decades. Two people who had proven that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest acts of kindness. As the family eventually began to depart, and quietness descended once more on the ranch, Killian and Victoria remained on their porch. It was their place, their tradition, their time to reflect on the day and each other. "I am tired," Victoria admitted, leaning more heavily against Killian. "But it is a good tired, the kind that comes from a full heart rather than a weary one." "Then let us go inside," Killian said, rising and offering her his hand with the same gallantry he had shown since the beginning. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and joys. Tonight we rest." They walked into their home together, closing the door on another day of the remarkable life they had built. Behind them, the prairie stretched endlessly under the stars, wild and beautiful and full of possibilities for those brave enough to claim them. And in a small corner of that vast landscape, on a ranch built by determination and sustained by love, two people who had found each other against all odds prepared for sleep, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Just as they had faced every day since that fateful afternoon when she collapsed halfway through hanging the laundry in the heat, and he finished it while she rested, and both their lives changed forever.